Good evening. Thank you. If we can all settle in. I know there are a few people that are still trickling in, but I think the rest of us are nice and settled in. A very good evening to everyone. Today is no ordinary day. It is no ordinary day, as today some of the biggest thinkers, researchers, and academics in the world gather on African soil to make a fire for generations to come. Among our wisdoms this evening are two of the most prolific writers whose imagination, sense of duty, and love have shaped our world and how we see ourselves in it. Nobel laureates, Professors JM Coetzee and Abdulrazak Gurnah have shattered wide open the glass ceilings in literature and written the world right here from Africa. And so, esteemed guests, a very good evening to you all, and welcome to the Chancellor's lecture. It is hosted as part of the Nobel Symposia series. It's an initiative of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study in partnership with the University of Stellenbosch under the auspices of the Nobel Foundation and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. A very good evening to you all. My name is Katlego Letlonkane, and I am thrilled, quite thrilled, to serve as this evening's program director, and I serve on behalf of Professor Sibusiso Moyo, who is not here today. Prof Sibu Moyo is our DVC for Research, Innovation, and Postgraduate Studies. Prof Sibu could not be here today. She's out of the country on work commitments, and so I will gladly take her place just for this evening. So a special greeting to our honored guests, our Nobel laureates, Professors JM Coetzee and Abdulrazak Gurnah, our Chancellor in his absence, our Rector, and VC, Prof Stefan Helgesson, members of the Rectorate this evening, students, members of faculty here today, colleagues from Stellenbosch University and other institutions, as well as colleagues and fellows from STIAS, that's the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies, and partners to this gathering, as well as members of the public who are joining here in person and online. You are all very, very welcome. And please join me in calling to the podium our Rector and Vice Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, Prof Stefan Helgesson.
Thank you very much, Katlego. Good evening to our esteemed and distinguished guests, our esteemed scholars, writers, and friends of Stellenbosch University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Chancellor's lecture, part of the week-long Nobel in Africa Symposium in Literature. We are honored to host this remarkable gathering of minds at Stellenbosch University in collaboration with the Nobel Foundation and the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Study, STIAS, a partnership that continues to place African scholarship and creativity at the center of global intellectual life. Allow me to begin by conveying the warm greetings on behalf of our Chancellor, Governor Lesetja Kanyako, who regrettably could not be with us this evening. He has asked me to express his deep admiration for the writers and the thinkers assembled here, and his belief that literature remains one of the most powerful forces in shaping just, imaginative, and humane societies. I think you can imagine the excitement with having two Nobel laureates speak to us tonight and share with us this evening. As I was walking in, our Dean for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Vasti, you a mere engineer, do you understand the gravity of this event, having two Nobel laureates in literature? And I can say, Vasti, I do. What an amazing event that we can host at Stellenbosch University. In an age often defined by haste and distraction, reading and writing invite us to slow down, to reflect, and to imagine differently. Our stories and the voices that tell them are not only a record of where we have been, but a map towards what we might yet become. African writing in particular continues to offer the world new ways of understanding resilience, belonging, and moral complexity. This evening's conversation, Africa Writes the World, is a rare and precious moment. Two Nobel laureates, Professors JM Coetzee and Abdulrazak Gurnah, in dialogue about the creative literature to illuminate our shared humanity. Their work, distinct yet resonant, reminds us that writing can transcend borders, bridge histories, and deepen empathy. We are deeply grateful to our conveners, Professors Louise Green, Tina Steiner, Maria Olesen, and Stefan Helgesson for curating this profound encounter. Grateful as well to STIAS for its enduring role in advancing scholarship that connects Africa to the world, and to the Nobel Foundation and the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for their ongoing collaboration with Stellenbosch University and STIAS through the Nobel in Africa series. As we listen tonight, may we be reminded that Africa does not merely add its voice to global literature, it writes the world anew. Thank you very much. Welcome once again, and I wish you all a deeply inspiring evening.
Thank you so much, Professor Daresh Ramjagannath. And in the spirit of this precious and rare moment, may I ask Professor Vasti Rutt to join us on stage. Professor Vasti is the Dean for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at Stellenbosch University. Please do the honors of introducing our guest this evening.
Good evening, everyone. Perhaps to Professor Ramjagannath, he is the one who mentioned to me that he was an engineer, and I replied that he's also a human being. So good evening again, and what an evening it is. Looking out, seeing Abdulrazak Gurnah and JM Coetzee sitting side by side, about to talk to each other and to us. It is my privilege this evening to introduce these two Nobel laureates and their interlocutor. I say it is a privilege, but really it is an impertinence. It is not as if JM Coetzee and Abdulrazak Gurnah need introductions from me or from anyone. But that in itself is something for us to ponder. The audience tonight ranges across the spectrum of human interest and endeavor, across disciplines and professions, speaking different tongues, coming from different countries and histories, shaped by different beliefs. Yet here we all are, gathered to listen to these two novelists. So what is it about them in particular that has drawn us here? I ask this at a time when an algorithm can generate reams of texts, perhaps even a novel, in the style of a Coetzee or a Gurnah. Even so, we are not here for the texts alone. We are here for the sake of a uniquely human achievement, the intentional creative consciousness that selects from the undifferentiated stream of experience certain fragments and arranges them into stories that compel us and move us. We are moved by their writing, not because it parrots our words back to us, but because it represents the world and the human condition in ways that unsettle, wound, and delight. It is writing that rouses us from the slumber of habit, from the dull certainty that we already know the world and our place in it. To borrow a phrase from another writer, Franz Kafka, their books are an axe for the frozen sea inside us. Abdulrazak Gurnah and John Coetzee were born in the same decade on the same continent. Coetzee in Cape Town in 1940, Gurnah in Zanzibar in 1948. Both are novelists, essayists, and literary scholars whose work grapples with colonial domination and its aftermath, with memory, place, and belonging, and with language, especially the uneasy legacy of English in post-colonial writing and experience. Beyond their literary achievements, both have had distinguished academic careers. Coetzee as Professor of General Literature at the University of Cape Town, and Gurnah as Professor of English and Post-Colonial Literatures at the University of Kent. Both now live far from their places of birth. And both, of course, have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, Coetzee in 2003 and Gurnah in 2021. The intersections between the lives and writings of these two novelists promise to make this evening's conversation an illuminating one. Yet they remain profoundly distinct writers, each with his own history and voice. Coetzee bore witness to the institutionalization of apartheid in South Africa and to its effects on human relationships and moral character, as well as the tension between personal commitments and political conviction. He has explored these complexities with moral gravity and intellectual precision across 18 novels and other writings. Since his international breakthrough with Waiting for the Barbarians in 1980, he has been a two-time winner of the Booker Prize for Life and Times of Michael Kay and for Disgrace, among many other prizes and honors. His Nobel citation reads, "For his well-crafted composition, pregnant dialogue, and analytical brilliance in tackling the enduring issues of the human condition and social injustice." Abdulrazak Gurnah grew up in the multilingual, cosmopolitan world of the Swahili coast. This background fostered a sensibility attuned to contradiction, negotiation, and displacement, qualities that mark all 11 of his novels, his short stories, and essays. His work is marked by a compassionate realism and ethical imagination. It speaks of the cultural and political ruptures of colonialism and the violence that followed independence. Forced to leave Zanzibar in 1964, he settled in England, where his fiction continues to explore the afterlives of empire. His novel Paradise was shortlisted for the Booker, Whitbread, and Writers' Guild Prizes. By the Sea was longlisted for the Booker and shortlisted for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. And the novel Desertion was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Prize. His Nobel citation reads, "For his uncompromising and compassionate penetration of the effects of colonialism and the fate of the refugee in the gulf between cultures and continents." This evening, the two novelists will be in conversation with Professor Stefan Helgesson of Stockholm University, a leading scholar of post-colonial and world literatures. Professor Helgesson serves as Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Vice-Rector of Human Science at Stockholm University. His research has explored literature and literary history in global contexts, post-Second World War writing in Southern Africa, and translation in the work of South African and other African authors. He is also a novelist himself, author of, and forgive my Swedish, Leve fortsättarna, which translates beautifully as "Long live the continuers," or "Long live those who carry on." And so let us now carry on by turning to the conversation that you have all come to hear. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Abdulrazak Gurnah, JM Coetzee, and Stefan Helgesson.
I should say something briefly about this evening's format. We will be hearing two talks, back-to-back, by JM Coetzee and Abdulrazak Gurnah. And after that, we will engage in conversation. I can also clarify from the outset that there will be no questions from the audience.
Greetings, everyone. Professor Abdulrazak Gurnah and I are on the stage today in Stellenbosch, South Africa, as a result of decisions made in the past by the Swedish Academy in Stockholm. He and I are here not because we've been crowned by any putative African academy, but because we won a Swedish prize, a prize which carries more prestige in Africa than any imaginable African prize might carry. If you do not find this state of affairs strange, disturbing, anomalous, I certainly do. So I would like to use the occasion to think about literary prizes, the Nobel Prize in particular, and how prizes fit into what I will call the literary economy. The first Nobel Prize in Literature was awarded in the year 1901. For some years, the prize had a narrow regional remit. More often than not, it would be awarded to a Nordic writer. However, because of their mind-boggling lavishness, it and the other 4 Nobel Prizes attracted worldwide attention, and the organization behind them widened its scope. In a matter of years, competition for the Nobel Prizes became, in fact, as well as in name, worldwide. Furthermore, in the case of the Literature Prize in particular, an informal principle of rotation among the continents emerged, followed by a principle of rotation between men and women. No such principle of rotation emerged among the science prizes, the prizes for physics, chemistry, and medicine. These have continued to be won overwhelmingly by North Americans and Europeans. The science prizes bring with them not only money, but also prestige for the prize winners and the countries they represent. In the case of the Literature Prize, the question of national prestige is more complicated. Prize winners are frequently at odds with their national regime, which may regard the award as a slap in the national face rather than an occasion for celebration. In fact, there have been cases when the Academy awarded the prize as a deliberate sign of disapproval of a regime. The Soviets saw the award of the prize to Boris Pasternak in 1958 as politically motivated and refused him a passport to travel to Stockholm to receive the prize. During the past 40 years, as a consequence of its tacit policy decision to rotate the Literature Prize among the continents, the prize has been awarded to Africa 6 times, to Asia 5 times, to Latin America 4 times, to Australia once. The idea of allotting writers to continents rather than, say, to literary traditions is, of course, crude. The literature of Latin America is closely bound up with the literature of the Iberian Peninsula. The literature of North Africa is closely bound up with the literature of the Middle East. But the Swedish Academy is not carrying out an exercise in literary genealogy. By spreading its laureates across the globe, it is merely trying to show that its reach is all-inclusive. As I've said, the prize has been awarded to Africa 6 times under the present globalist universalist dispensation. To be an African candidate, it is not necessary to write in an African language, or live and work in Africa, or have a following among African readers. It is enough, it would seem, to have been born in Africa, or even just to have spent your formative years here. I'm thinking of Doris Lessing. Being embedded in an African tradition and writing in an African language does not score points for you. I'm thinking of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The members of the Swedish Academy are intelligent, thoughtful people. They are well aware that they are no more experts on African literature than they are experts on Chinese literature. When they award their prize to an African or a Chinese writer, they understand perfectly well, I believe, that it is a limited gesture they are performing, necessarily limited, but nevertheless a good one. Good for the writer in question and good for the world too. So let us try to look at the prizes charitably from the viewpoint of the Academy and the Nobel Foundation behind it. Alfred Nobel died in 1896 at the age of 63, a wealthy man. His fortune was based first on dynamite, which he invented, and subsequently on a string of chemical engineering enterprises. In his will, he left the bulk of his estate to fund 5 annual prizes. According to the will, the prizes were to be awarded to, and I quote, those people who during the preceding year have conferred the greatest benefit to mankind, end quote. In the case of literature, the prize was to go to the person, I quote, who shall have produced the most outstanding work in an ideal direction, end quote. And the winner of the Literature Prize was to be selected by the Swedish Academy. The deliberations of the Swedish Academy take place in secret, but one can surmise that the formula outstanding work in an ideal direction has caused the Academy headaches over the years. What exactly does ideal mean? How tightly is the Academy bound by a will that employs concepts dating back to the 19th century? Is the Academy not entitled to reinterpret its mandate in today's terms? How many writers today can be said to follow an ideal direction? Alfred Nobel was a more interesting person than one might guess. He was a pioneering experimental chemist, but he also wrote poems, plays, and novels. His favorite writer was the Swedish poet Viktor Rydberg, now pretty much forgotten. As a writer, Nobel called himself a follower of Rydberg, I quote, super idealist, a kind of ungifted Rydberg. He believed in onward and upward progress and in the triumph of the human spirit. In particular, he believed it was the historical role of great men, great spirits, to lead mankind into the future. The Swedish Academy of the 21st century has quietly dropped the criterion of lofty idealism and does not try to argue the case that its prize winners have brought benefit to mankind. Instead, the Academy concentrates on the practical task that has been entrusted to it, the task of naming an annual winner. In this respect, it is admirably revealing about its modus operandi. The Academy receives 100 to 150 nominations per annum, some of them repeated year after year. A committee of the Academy takes on the job of exploring the merits of the nominees, if necessary, calling on expert helpers. Persons who have been nominated for extra literary reasons, political, regional, ideological, are weeded out. The candidates' publications are then procured, where necessary, in translation. Scholars are commissioned to submit reviews and reports. The upshot of the committee's investigations is a ranked list of the top candidates, which it submits to the full Academy with supporting materials. The Academy then begins its deliberations, which take place in secret. Only its final choice is officially announced. No dissenting opinions may be made public. As must be abundantly clear from this account, the Academy prides itself on the thoroughness and fairness of its procedures. It is not blind to the fact that it is made up of people of a certain age and a certain uniform background with a certain uniformity of taste. I quote a spokesman for the Academy: "The coming of new generations with unavoidable changes in literary tastes cannot but be reflected in the history of the Nobel Prize." Unquote. Coming closer to home, it is also clear that the modus operandi of the Academy in a year when it awards the prize to an African writer, that writer has been measured not just against other African candidates, but against candidates from all over the world. In no sense has the competition ever been an African competition, taking note of the particularities of African literature or literatures. It is and has been intended to be a universal competition, relying on universalistic criteria, with the practices of continental and gender rotation afterwards superadded. I need to add that the principle of rotation is not mechanically applied. Just as there will be years when women do well in the ranking process and it seems appropriate for a woman to win the prize, so there will be years when Africans rank high and an African wins the prize. Relying on universalistic criteria, that is the key point. The Academy does its best to free itself of national or regional bias, thereby becoming universal, but at the same time is self-aware enough to acknowledge that it is no statistical accident that 12 literature winners in the past 25 years have been Europeans, and another 4 have made their homes in Europe and written in a European language. The members of the Academy are not visitors from another planet. As they well know, they are Swedish intellectuals steeped in European high culture. They are clear about what winning the Nobel Prize for Literature means. In any given year, the winner is a worthy representative of the best writing being done worldwide. He or she is not necessarily the best writer in the world, whatever that may mean. By these standards, there is no incompatibility between being a worthy recipient by world standards and being African, Asian, European, or anything else. What would an African version of the Nobel Prize look like? To address this question, is to enter into a game. It would be a game because there can realistically be no competing African version of the Nobel. The Nobel Prizes are backed by a huge and, if I may use the word, slick organization, the Nobel Foundation, with vast assets, tangible and intangible. The foundation is particularly good at extracting value from the science laureates, who are presented to the public as brilliant men and women at the cutting edge of scientific research, people whose discoveries are going to shape the future we move into. It does its best with its literature laureates, but its treatment with them is more muted. It is not at all sure, I suspect, that they are at the cutting edge of anything, or that they are going to shape the future of humankind. Here is an example of the Nobel Foundation at work, advertising an event that took place in Sydney, Australia, last year, 2024. I quote, "To have 3 Nobel Prize laureates on stage together will be a unique opportunity to hear from some of the planet's brightest minds on how we can tackle society's most fundamental problems," unquote. The 3 laureates in question happened to be scientists. Behind the advertisement lay the unstated and highly questionable claim that people who have proved their excellence in one realm of thought, for example, particle physics, possess a generalizable power of creative thought, generalizable in the sense that it can be transferred from physics or medicine to, quote unquote, society's most fundamental problems. However, the Nobel formula works. There is no reason why it should not continue to work long into the future. No All Africa Prize can hope to attain the level of worldwide attention that the Nobel Prizes command every October, the month when they are announced. Nevertheless, if we play the game of imagining an All-Africa Prize or an African laureateship, we can begin by saying 3 things. 1, such a prize needs to be conceived from the ground up by Africans. 2, it needs to be organized year after year by Africans. 3, it needs to be judged by Africans employing African standards. What African standards means will have to be debated beforehand, and that debate will undoubtedly be long and difficult. I conclude. Why all this talk about prizes? What we are looking for ultimately are surely not prize-winning books, but good books, great books, books that articulate what we common mortals do not have the words for. The texture of life, ordinary, day-to-day life, in the ordinary but also extraordinarily beautiful part of God's world that this is. Nevertheless, prizes are part, an indispensable part, it would seem, of what we can call a modern literary economy, an economy that encompasses writers and translators and publishers and literary agents and copyright lawyers and accountants and printers and reviewers and publicists and bookshops and panels of judges and the prizes these judges award and literary magazines and teachers of literature and students of literature and literary festivals and benefactors of those festivals. The concept of a literary economy is a useful one. We can think of national literary economies, of which the South African literary economy would be an example, and regional or linguistic literary economies, and capping it all, a world literary economy featuring worldwide book marketing systems like the Frankfurt Book Fair and entities like the Nobel Foundation, whose job is to identify winners and show them off to the world as they are doing indirectly here today. Thank you.
Oh, hello, everybody. So, our subject, our title of this event is Africa Writes the World. And I want to start there. Now, I know what was the first thing that occurred to me in relation to this proposition. But I won't tell you yet. I'll tell you later. I want to begin with some preliminary questions first. First of all, what is referred to by the world here? Is it Europe? The West? If it is not Africa Writes Africa, which you would have thought would be top of the agenda, then it would be Africa Writes the Other. I guess in practice, this other turns out to be Europe and the West, for obvious historical reasons. On the other hand, there are also some very, very good historical reasons why Africa should write the Indian Ocean, or the Mediterranean, or Latin America. But the impulse seems to be to engage with Europe and the West. It is that impulse that seems stronger. We'll return to that. But in relation to this idea, this understanding that, in fact, writing the world means writing about the encounter or the engagement with Europe and the West. In relation to this, I was reminded, I'll interrupt myself, during this symposium so far, there have been several mentions of the Congress, no, not Congress, of the conference, I think it was, of African writers in Kampala in 1962 as somehow an epiphanic moment, or at least a very powerful and important moment, and somehow, if not parallel, but like this gathering that we now have here in Stellenbosch now, in this week. But I was actually reminded of an earlier event, which is that remarkable gathering in Paris, which began on Wednesday, September 19th, until Saturday, September 22nd, in 1956. The Congress of Black Writers and Artists, which was organized by, among others, Alioune Diop of Présence Africaine, among others. And it brought together writers and artists from Africa, from the Caribbean, and from North America. Among the North Americans was James Baldwin, who afterwards wrote the well-known essay, Princes and Power. The essay was actually published in the literary journal Profs, which, unknown to Baldwin, was a front for the CIA, which may sound shocking, but actually there were so many other publications which also unknowingly were funded by the CIA, including the radical African magazine, Transition, which discovered, rather embarrassingly, that while it was being radical, actually its funding was mostly coming from the League of Cultural Freedom. In any case, Baldwin, in his essay, Princes and Powers, reports that Alain Diop opened the conference with the words that it was, I quote, and I'm quoting Baldwin, not Alain Diop. Well, we have to assume that he was quoting Alain Diop, but I don't know. But I know that I'm quoting Baldwin. So he's saying this is what Alain Diop said, that the Congress was, quoting, an attempt to open a dialogue with Europe. But it soon becomes clear, end of that quote, but it soon becomes clear that Baldwin is skeptical of the agonies of being a black writer in Europe. He's also skeptical of Aimé Césaire's presentation, which he considers a demagoguery, and which he thinks satisfies the audience who applaud him to the skies. He's skeptical of Alexis Joseph, one of the organizers of the Congress and one of a Haitian writer. He is also skeptical of Cheikh Anta Diop and of Leopold Senghor's invocation of African arts. These are all, of course, stalwarts of negritude. The essay, it seems to me, is written from the point of view of the man of the house, familiar with the ways of the people of the house, and now observing the agony of the desire for recognition among these black writers and artists from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Antilles. It's interesting. You notice, I hope I use Caribbean and Antilles, but both words actually refer to the same area. It's just that if you've been colonized by the British, you're the Caribbean, and if you've been colonized by the French, you're the Antilles. Nice little ironies all over the place. Anyway, Baldwin suggests that, I quote again, a gulf yawns between the American Negro. In those days, Negro was still a word that was okay to use. A gulf yawns between the American Negro and all other men of color, end of quote, which saddens him because, I quote again, the American Negro is possibly the only man of color who can speak of the West with real authority. Despite the suspicion of contrasting expectations, that is to say, what Baldwin expects of this gathering and what the gathering expects, presumably, or at least the organizers, what they expect of this. So despite the suspicion of contrasting expectations, Baldwin still asks, what then do these black people have in common? What they held in common, he answers himself, I'm quoting, what they held in common was their precarious, their unutterably painful relation to the white world. End of quote. I'm not sure. I think Baldwin is putting forward an incomplete description of both the historical and the ongoing, even at that period, engagement with colonial encounters, which it seems to me he appears to see as a kind of cringing helplessness. So I would now like to read you a poem which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So this was the first thing that occurred to me in relation to the proposition that is the subject of our gathering. And the poem is Telephone Conversation by Wolof, as I can already hear a couple of satisfied and happy sighs from. But anyway, let's read the poem. The price seemed reasonable, location indifferent. The landlady swore she lived off premises. Nothing remained but self-confession. Madam, I warned, I hate a wasted journey. I'm African. Silence. Silence transmission of pressurized good breeding. Voice, when it came, lipstick coated, long gold rolled cigarette holder pipped. Caught I was, foully. How dark? I had not misheard. Are you light or very dark? Button B, button A. Stench of rancid breath of public hide and speak. Red booths, red pillar box, red double-tiered omnibus, squelching tar. It was real. Shamed by ill-mannered silence, surrender pushed dumbfoundedness to beg simplification. Considerate she was, varying the emphasis. Are you dark or very light? Revelation came. You mean like plain or milk chocolate? Her assent was clinical, crushing in its light impersonality. Rapidly, wavelength adjusted, I chose West African sepia. And as an afterthought, down in my passport. Silence for spectroscopic flight of fancy, till truthfulness clanged her accent hard on the mouthpiece. What's that? Conceding, don't know what that is. Like brunette. That's dark, isn't it? Not altogether. Facially, I'm brunette, but madam, you should see the rest of me. Palm of my hand, soles of my feet are a peroxide blonde. Friction caused foolishly, madam, by sitting down has turned my bottom raven black. One moment, madam, sensing her receiver rearing on the thunderclap about my ears. Madam, I pleaded, wouldn't you rather see for yourself? I first read that poem in 1963 when I was 15-year-old schoolboy in Zanzibar in a publication called The Elizabethan to celebrate the recent Elizabeth, not the other one, not the ancient one. I don't exactly know who produced this publication, the British Council, the Colonial Office. There was such a department in those days, the Foreign Office. And at that time, of course, I didn't even stop to wonder who produced this publication. It was the kind of publication to be found in that corner of the school library. We were still colonized in 1963. Clearly intended for the colonial school child with informative articles about a historical personage, probably European, something about health, a balanced diet, some pictures of English life. It was in fact in that same Elizabethan that I saw my first pictures of the University of Kent, where I ended up spending most of my adult life, in a feature about new universities then in the process of being built. And often there was a poem or a story, and that's where I read this poem. I love the line, madam, how does it go? Would you rather not see the rest of me? I love it. Anyway, that's why I read the poem. In the opening of the poem, the African is courteous and seeks to avoid embarrassment, whereas the woman is well-bred by rote. She is portrayed fairly precisely as a woman of a certain class, in a stagey, cliched way. And with a worldview we can guess at from that same stagey persona. or to use adjectives that would have been familiar as a way of characterizing her social and intellectual location, the opening description suggests someone both vulgar and shallow. So shocked is our African young man, although you notice without anger, that he has to have a quick look to see if this is really happening. The references, I don't know if you all picked them up, about the button A, button B, and so on, is the old telephone booth which used to have those buttons. So he has to check, what's going on? Is it happening? You notice also the two silences. Hers is described as silence transmission of pressurized good breeding. Our young African gives the woman the benefit of the doubt and takes her silence as a kind of courtesy, or at least pretends to, because he cannot resist ironizing her with that pressurized. Her manner is something forced and natural, causing her discomfort. In other words, our speaker is still very courteous in manner as well as in attitude of mind. But then as the woman's meanness is revealed, her speech is given a hard, capitalized form, as you saw there in the poem, to match the ugliness of her self-assurance. The irony will get heavier until, in the end, she will have been given enough opportunity to express her intolerance and to make herself a proper subject of mockery. That's how to deal with narrow-mindedness, I thought when I read the poem. Courteously as required, and then a thrust of wit to silence the beast. That is what appealed to me then. Not because at the time I was thinking of this as a useful method of operating as a stranger in England. I wasn't thinking like that, or even thinking of England. It was the audacity that appealed. When you meet someone saying ugly, diminishing things, deal with them with courtesy and devastating wit. As I discovered, when I did go to England, the reality is a lot less cleaner than this collected and macho display. But my point is that this is to asceticize the encounter, to position this migrant figure as both sensitive and capable of holding his own against intolerance. So, not cringing then. Incidentally, in reading about that Congress, which I read in other places as well as James Baldwin, there is no mention of any women delegates at that event. And nor does Baldwin mention a single woman delegate. But he does mention, or he has a description of George Lamming, the novelist mostly. I suppose he had other things, but certainly mostly a novelist from the Caribbean, from Barbados, who was also a participant of the Congress. And this is his description of Lamming. This is, remember, 1956. Lamming had, I think, probably only just published one novel then. One? Yeah. I'm checking with the expert. So he was still a young writer, relatively, not as famous as Baldwin was. Anyway, this is Baldwin's description of Lamming. He says, Lamming is tall, raw-boned, untidy, and intense. And one of his real distinctions is his refusal to be intimidated by the fact that he's a genuine writer. End of quotation. Or rather, it continues, but it's broken. Anyway, continue with him and his description. He's now quoting Lamming, saying, "The profession of letters is an untidy one," he began. End of Lamming's quote. Now, Lamming continues, looking as though he had dressed to prove it. He suggested that it was important to bear in mind that the word Negro, the Congress of Negro Writers and Artists, he suggested that it was important to bear in mind that the word Negro meant black and meant nothing more than that. that the nature of power was unrelated to pigmentation, that bad faith was a phenomenon which was independent of race. I respected him very much. He was concerned with the immensity and the variety of the experience called Negro. He was concerned that one should recognize this variety as wealth. That's the end of Baldwin's quotation. So that was lambing in 1956, so that was lambing as reported by Baldwin. But here's Lamming himself in 1984, in the new introduction of his brilliant collection of essays, The Pleasures of Exile. It was first published in 1960, but it was reissued in 1984, and he wrote a new introduction for it. And he says in that introduction, quoting himself, this is something that he had said somewhere else at another occasion, but it's okay, he's quoting himself in the introduction. He says, "I know there are those among you who tremble at the sound of the blunt and simple word black, and who, apologizing for your own victimization, nervously anticipate a message of race. But when we say black, it has no biological meaning, nor is it used in the service of racial applause. When I say black, it is in the name of a profound and unique historical experience borne by a particular group of men and women whose presence in the world was destined to transform the eyes and ears of the world, and whose ultimate liberation will be the decisive contribution to the liberation of all mankind." I hear a ring of negritude in that call to transformation, which of course was the informing ethos of that gathering in 1956, which James Baldwin was so skeptical of, and which indeed Lamming too seemed to be quoted as being skeptical of. So I will now leave you with three questions. Was that a man speaking or the period speaking? Does anyone write about the experience of migration with affection? Many of you certainly who are writers, of course, but I don't know how many writers are here. I know many of the writers who are there at the symposium anyway. Many of you have written about the encounter and experience of the world in this sense. And I wonder, do women write about it differently? Thank you.
Thanks both for these high-density talks that approach the topic of the evening, Africa Writes the World, from two very different angles. Our conversation now is meant to expand that theme and perhaps not focus too closely on what you already have put forward for consideration. I would nonetheless like to make a few initial observations about these talks and see where we can go from there. Beginning with your talk, Razak, it could be described as a two-part or even three-part reflection. You open with some pertinent questions about what the phrase Africa Writes the World could mean. You discuss Baldwin's account, skeptical account of that 56 Congress. And then by bringing Wallace Wienke's poem Telephone Conversation into the picture, you look at an actual instance of writing the world, and you express appreciation of the poem's sardonic humor and the way the speaker managed to turn an instance of a racist refusal of the other's right to belong, others within quotes, into a moment of self-assertion, not cringing, as you said. At the same time, and this I find interesting, you mentioned that you first read the poem as a youngster in Zanzibar, and that it was mediated through what was then colonial channels of textual dissemination. This confronts us with the internal contradictions of a colonially structured world, and cautions perhaps also against monolithic conceptions of historical periods, which speaks to your last question. Is it the man or the period speaking? To speak plainly, even when shaped by the dominance of the English language and of publishing infrastructures in Europe, the institution that we call literature could grant someone like Wienke the qualified agency to turn the tables on racism. And we can return to this shortly. As for your piece, John, it reflects on the condition of possibility for this very conversation we're having. Literature, after all, is not stardust and thin air, but emerges from very real social circumstances. Prizes have become an increasingly important part of those circumstances, combining as they do both pecuniary and symbolic capital. I like the idea of a prize such as the Nobel being awarded in Africa, by Africa. Besides illustrating the strangeness of the global prestige of the Nobel, which I happily concede, bearing a Swedish name as I do and based in Stockholm as I am, it shifts attention to how any particular place could, in principle, build an international reputation in the literary economy. In The Economy of Prestige, a book published some 20 years ago by the scholar James F. English, it becomes clear, however, that the Nobel Prizes have one advantage over others: age. Nobel more or less inaugurated the prize era, which has continued its expansion since then. Today one sometimes hears the joke that there is one prize for each writer. The age of the Nobel Prize alerts us, however, to another aspect of your talk. What the Nobel Prize for Literature awarded 100 years ago is not what it awards today. Literature and literary values change. The prize in its own way must also change. So let's pause there and think about what changes and what remains painfully the same. So to start this off, therefore, my question to the two of you is this. Both your talks address an unevenness between Africa and the world, or specifically between writing from and of Africa and an outer world experienced as, by turns, hostile or problematically benign. At the same time, we are today living in an era when African and Africa-related writers more than ever have found readerships on different continents. 2021, for example, was a very successful year for African writers in terms of the international literary awards. Would both of you, either of you, care to reflect on this change, its contradictions and its implications for literature in African contexts? Who would like to go first?
Yes, as you say, the Nobel Prize has certainly changed over the years. The Nobel Prize in Literature, I think, has changed over the years. I'm not so sure that the prizes in the sciences have changed at all. And there are obvious reasons for that. I think the ideology of science hasn't changed at all since the middle of the 19th century. As I said, the Literature Prize was originally fairly narrowly conceived. It was at first won usually by Scandinavian writers, and then it broadened its remit to include writers from all over the world, and then it began to address its gender imbalance, and so it has changed a lot in that respect over the years. I'd just like to pick up on your comment that you like, Stefan, you like the idea of a prize awarded in Africa. I think that perhaps, on second thoughts, a laureate position in Africa might be more fitting than an African equivalent of the Nobel. Some laureate who is declared annually by a jury of respected literary people from across the continent, a laureate who is funded to travel for a year or 2 years perhaps, travel around the continent from region to region, from festival to festival, generally raising the profile of literature in a continent where its profile is, if I can use the word, low.
We're taking notes. That's an excellent idea. Thanks.
I've just recently, maybe 10 days ago, I was in Sweden, and I attended an event in Malmö, which is a city I'd never been to before. And I do believe that it has a very large concentration, if that's the right word, in any case, a large population of migrant, non-Swedish migrants, who are probably Swedes now, but anyway. And the person who chaired the event, as you are doing, Stefan, was Paul, Matt can help me here, who's just recently published a book on the Nobel Prize.
Paul Tangat.
Absolutely, that's him. And he gave me a copy of his book, not the new book, because that's in Swedish, and I don't, unfortunately, read in Swedish, but he had a previous book, which was in English, which was more of an academic type book rather. This, I believe, has more gossip in it, the Swedish one, which sounds really interesting, but I'll have to wait for that when it's translated. But what I saw from reading that is that indeed the prize has changed over the 122 years or so, and that there were some enormous changes that happened in the 1950s, in particular, if I've got that right. So anyway, after the war, after the Second World War, I mean, not the war. When that prize began to acquire, I suppose, what is now its global impact or its global reach, and all the things that we associate with it, the secrecy of the committee, for example, or the idea of making sure that there is a global, spread, as you put it, the notion of distributing, that these were the developments of that prize as it understood its significance now as something global rather than something, well, relatively relatively local, although relatively global at the same time. So, in answer to the question, I think prizes also, I've seen this happen to other prizes, the Booker Prize, if you like, or the Kane Prize. Prizes change as they, I think, as they understand their power or their force. I don't mean power in a manipulative sense, but as they understand their impact, then there is a greater self-consciousness, I think, about what it is they think they're doing. Because newspapers pay attention, writers value them more, because now they have this impact and so on. So it's, I don't think it's kind of completely okay, prizes do this, prizes do that, because I think they are now, it's a beautiful thing. I think prizes are a good thing too. And there's so many that the multiplicity maybe is also a way of diminishing the power, if you like, of one particular one. The Nobel still retains its unique power. I don't really know why, but I think it's a good thing for the time being.
Yes, again, I think it is precisely its age that explains why it retains its power. I'm very glad you met Paul Tengut and I started reading his book because it's probably the most thorough account so far of the history of the Nobel Prize for Literature. And he dives deeply into the sources. One can mention that the secrecy of the Nobel Prize for Literature lasts 50 years. So it's like this moving barrier. Now it would be the year 1974. You can go into the archives and actually see, read the notes from the meetings of the Academy. But yes.
Stefan, can I interrupt you for just one moment to say one last word about prizes? The prizes don't acquire their power by magic. The Nobel Prize and the Booker Prize in particular have powerful organizations behind them which promote them and do so very skillfully.
I completely agree. In fact, I know very well from, or at least I think, from my experience of when it was that the Booker Prize became what it has become more recently, and that was when it was televised, which was, I think, 1980, that it was for the first time that it was. Before that, it was a little minor prize, which would be announced in the newspapers, and that's it. If you look at the list of the first 10 winners or so of the Booker Prize, you might even be asking yourself, who are these people? But after 1980, we know them because television just blows them up. It becomes an occasion every year. It becomes something people argue. So I agree. I agree that it's not only managed by the organization behind it, it's managed because it becomes a cultural, social event, which is embraced by the media and magnified.
Yes, and I couldn't agree more. There's nothing magical about it, but it's carefully managed and achieved over time. Yes, perhaps turning away from prizes and looking more towards actual writing, literary cultures. I was interested, Razak, in your account of Soyinka's telephone conversation, the poem, and that encounter with it, because when Soyinka wrote that poem in the 1960s, the British context of reception either ignored African literature completely or tried to enfold it in a very Anglo-centric notion of the Commonwealth. Nonetheless, you were exposed to the poem in Zanzibar. And I would just like to help us to sort of explore that context a bit more. Could you tell us something about the kind of reading in various languages that was available to you in your early years and what it meant to you then?
Sure. I'll invoke Melville at this point. In Moby Dick, Herman Melville has a description, which I think I use in Desertion, actually, where he describes somebody as like an ostrich of potent digestion, sorry, not dimension. Like an ostrich of potent digestion, which pecks at fine herbs and flints indiscriminately. So that's the reading we did. We just read everything like an ostrich of potent digestion. So coming across this little thing that is almost like it wasn't even a pamphlet, it wasn't really a magazine. I don't know, several of the school things that we used to get were really just sheets, like a tabloid. And in there, unexpectedly, you see this poem. And I said, what is this thing? What is it? I'd never heard of Shrinker. I think the only African writer in 1963 that I had heard of were Achebe and Ngugi. And even then, we hadn't really read them or studied them, or may have heard, I think Ngugi heard an excerpt on the radio from Weep No Child, and I think I may have read Things Fall Apart, I'm not sure. And so who's this? And it was just so striking, such a strong poem, such a cheerful, in a way, in the end, poem. I didn't think anything about who produced this magazine or this thing. I was just reading this. Like I'm saying, like an ostrich, you just eat whatever there is. The questions come later when you understand the context better. But at that age, I think it was just, we were really rather starved, I think. So whatever came along, you read.
And other languages? Were you reading in?
Well, sure. Other languages that we would have read would be, of course, whatever was available in Kiswahili. In primary schools, we generally read whatever there was. Well, it's some translations. But you have to remember that it was still a colony. And much of what was produced for schools was often directed in a kind of organizational way from elsewhere. So we would have been reading the translations, and most of these translations were really rather predictable. The Man-Eater of Savo, you probably never even heard of this book, but it's a book about an event in the building of the railway in Kenya, and the Man-Eater attacks that were killing off the workers, or books like Treasure Island, or boys' books like that. And these would have been translated into whatever languages, probably in direction from the direction that the education policy was set in the colonial office in London. I am pretty sure children in the Caribbean, boys anyway, would have been reading similar books in other parts of the empire. So that's what was available, and a lot of stories, which were not printed stories, but one of the surprises for me, for example, was listening to stories at home and then discovering that these were actually stories from Alfu Lela Ulela, or 1001 Nights, which the person telling these stories might be, say, my mother or my aunt, and neither of them could read. So these were stories which were being transmitted orally and understood and passed on in this way. So there were a lot of those. So that was a kind of reading too, and the Quran, of course.
Fascinating combination, both of the sort of top-down dissemination from a colonial center and more of a bottom-up literary culture. If we turn to your early reading, John, and your location in Cape Town in the 1950s, could you
You say 1930s.
1950s. I said 1950s. It's written here. I can prove it. In the 1950s, I was wondering if you could just give us some examples of what counted as literature as you understood it then, or to approach this from another angle, what kind of a reader did your reading back then want you to become?
Yeah, well, as a child, I read omnivorously. I read the entire contents of the Worcester Public Library. But as a student, I went to university not to study literature, but to study mathematics. So the literature courses I did were somewhat peripheral. But I did do courses in the Department of English, and the Department of English clearly saw its job as transmitting a British English version of literature with a very heavy emphasis on Shakespeare and Austen and Dickens. I was at the same time reading contemporary American literature, which was more or less blocked from the university syllabus. Hemingway, Faulkner, younger novelists like Saul Bellow and Joseph Heller and John Barth. And I was reading American poetry too. I was deeply immersed in Ezra Pound and Wallace Stevens. And then there was the enormous impact that Samuel Beckett had when he burst on the scene in the 1950s.
So an interesting combination there of the two, at that time, the two centers of English language writing, the UK and the United States. So, I mean, it's interesting to hear these brief accounts of your reading in the 50s and 60s, and then to think again about what has changed since then, also in African contexts. I mean, to me, if we return to this basic topic of today, Africa Writes the World, one of the boldest attempts to articulate a cosmopolitan literary outlook from an African vantage point was the so-called Nairobi Revolution, sparked off by the department's circular on the abolition of the English department, probably the only department circular ever that has been canonized. Co-authored by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Taban Loliong, and Henry Owour Anyumba. In subsequent discussions of the circular, the emphasis there has often been on the insistence on an African route for literary education, but beyond Afrocentrism, what makes the manifesto remarkable, I think, is how it challenges precisely the British tradition by advocating for a thoroughly and perhaps impossibly cosmopolitan program of literary study, including African literature in numerous languages, Caribbean and North American literature, Russian, French, and Arabic literature, and so on. And that was more than 50 years ago. How would you say that their ambition back then compares with our contemporary practices of reading, the current literary culture that we all are a part of? I don't know who would like to respond.
Well, you probably have to look at what was the English department at the University of Nairobi doing at the time to put that in context. Why it seemed necessary for those three, all three of them comparatively young academics, have just recently returned from their studies. I think Taban Loliong from the United States and Ngugi from Leeds. And so what they were addressing was a culture, a departmental culture, a program that they found intolerable in this way. But the problem, as you know very well, being somebody who works in a university, the problem is you can't really say, let's open this up and teach Arabic, English, Swahili, whatever, Russian, and so on. Because these always are kind of like baronial enclaves, as it were. There's somebody who's the expert in Russian literature, somebody, and so on. These things are done in this way. You have to, in order to be able to deliver the knowledge and so on, you have to be very well informed about whatever the subject is that you're teaching. You can't just teach everything in a spirit of sort of liberation. So fine, the idea is it's a challenge to a certain narrow curriculum. But the answer is not to say, okay, now we'll teach everything.
As you say, it's, as a dean myself, I know precisely how narrow specializations can be and sometimes need to be. So I completely agree that it was ultimately an impossible program. It's still interesting to see the syllabus in what became the Department of Literature in Nairobi around 1970-71, which still tried to realize some of that ambition, some of that deep challenge that they...
Yeah, well, fine, but it couldn't be sustained, could it?
Very likely not. It had to be more limited than that in actual practice. I was wondering if you had any thought on this question about the Nairobi Revolution.
I really don't. I know of the Nairobi manifesto only at second hand, so I'll leave it.
Now, I've been moving towards the question of language and multiple languages, and both of you have made your careers as writers in the English language. Over the years, both of you have also, increasingly I would say, put pressure on the assumed monolingualism that characterizes much of the English-speaking world. In Speaking in Tongues, the very recent book that you co-wrote with the translator Mariana Dimopoulos, John, you mention your attempt with your novel or novella, The Pole, to put a spanner in the works of the globally dominant Anglophone literary economy. Would you care to say anything about that attempt, its purpose, and perhaps also its failure?
Yeah. I don't want to go on too long about the Pole because it's a very complicated story. But briefly, I'd for some years been feeling uneasy about the growing power of English in the world and its flattening effect. Every university-educated person seemed to be learning to think in the English way. For years I'd been publishing in Dutch translation before publishing in English, but Dutch is more or less fated to be a minor language, so I began to publish in Spanish translation first, before English. And a couple of years ago, I embarked on the book that you mentioned, a book that was intended to put the idea of what was the original and what was the translation into question. So, working with Mariana Dimopoulos, whom you mentioned, I produced this book, The Pole, which, although written in the first place in English, also was meant to exist in a Spanish version that was in no way secondary to the English. Now, what does it mean to be secondary? Well, it means that Mariana's Spanish version had to be back-translated, so to speak, into the English text. So instead of the Spanish carrying the marks of being a translation, the English was revised so that it conformed with the Spanish, and the Spanish lost its marks of being a translation and therefore being secondary. Neither version predominated, neither came first. And then, as you say, the project came to nothing, because publishers in other languages other than English, other than Spanish, refused to translate from the Spanish. They said, I was known to be an English language writer, therefore the English version had to be the original version, and that was that. And that was the end of the story.
Yes, it's a very interesting example of the literary economy and how in no way does a writer themselves determine really the conditions of that economy. Razak, I'd like to ask you, what do you find important, crucial in your practice as a writer in the politics of literary language and multilingualism, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I write in a language that I feel comfortable in. That's the main thing. Am I correct in thinking that your first language is Swedish?
Yes and no. I mean, I grew up bilingually, but my parents were Swedish, yes.
Oh, your parents are Swedish. But you write in English?
Well, as an academic, I write in English. Yes, mostly.
So you have some insight into this question you're asking me.
It's a personal passion of mine. Yes.
So I mean, I could just as easily say it. You have a choice. You choose to write in English. I have a choice. I choose to write in English. Do I need to defend myself?
That is definitely not what I'm asking. My question comes from the observation that in your, shall we say, the later half of your novels and perhaps more frequently the last 10 years or so, it seems to me that you are bringing Swahili into your English language writing. I'm not in any way sort of questioning the right to write in the language one is comfortable in. I'm more. It would be interesting if there is some change there in your own practice.
I'll be happy to say why there are some non-English words or forms or references. I don't think just in the last 10 years. I think if you go back to even to memory departure, you'll find the words there. But I suppose I now feel greater confidence about but inserting non-English forms or non-English expressions. And the reason for this, or there are several reasons for this, but one reason is because very often there isn't always the exact equivalent that I want to use there, because the process of writing about an event which is being imagined or being spoken about in another language, in Swahili, say, these people are doing that. That's how they're talking or thinking. But I'm writing about that event in English. So there are occasions when there isn't the exact word. I know there is an English possible alternative, but it's not. So I think, well, I just use that word, but make sure that its meaning is clear. And since I have readers in many places, and some of them know what that word means, they understand that. And if they don't understand that, then its meaning is made clear anyway. And that's one reason. There isn't an exact equivalent. The other reason is, in a way, it's also to establish that this is not happening in Tunbridge Wells. This is happening somewhere else. So as it were, to to nudge the reader, if that's the case, into remembering the location, or that it is not just simply the same street that he or she might be familiar with if they're reading in England, say, or indeed if they're reading Buenos Aires. So that's another reason. And the third reason, because it gives us a kind of a more immediate sense. I remember reading Russian novels as a teenager, say, without great understanding probably, not in Russian, in English, and coming across all kinds of words that I didn't know what this was or that was, but you guess, and you move on. And then when you have a moment, these days it's dead easy, you just Google. I have my phone beside me when I'm reading, and I read something, and whereas the practice, most of my reading practice has been, I don't know what that is, but I think I know what it is, and move on. And so sometimes for years, you go reading this and you see a word again and again and again, but you think, but these days I just Google it. I think, oh, I didn't know it was that. And the precision with which Google can give you, it's a fruit of this kind or that kind of thing. But, that's how we read books, that's how we read literature, with some degree of understanding, but without full understanding. And then if we have time to spare, we look into it a little bit.
Yes, I really like that description of how reading can move sort of in and out of comprehension, and that it doesn't have to be a problem that one doesn't know precisely what each word means. I mean, just to elaborate a bit on what I said earlier, there's this remarkable moment in Afterlives where there's also a poem in German, I think by Schiller, that is important in a moment in the narrative, and which is then, we understand, translated into Swahili. And it's a very it's a moment of intriguing sort of linguistic hospitality, I think.
Yeah, and part of the complication is that, of course, I've first read that poem in English and realized many years ago, and realized when I came back to it to use in that moment that there is more than one translation. So I thought the best deal is to just put the German in there and then translate it into Swahili, so then I don't have to decide which English version I'm going to put in there.
Thanks, that makes a lot of sense, actually. One has to find solutions when writing. We are sort of drawing towards a close here. I have a couple of questions left. I mean, one reason why I'm pushing the question of language is because it reflects also on the ongoing symposium this week. We're a very multilingual gathering, but what unites us, besides Africa, is our attachment in one way or another to what I call the Anglosphere. But if we speak in terms of transnational literary economies, however, there are significant such economies of African writing in French, Portuguese, Arabic, and important literary traditions in countries such as Angola, Senegal, Mozambique, which are not really included in the Anglosphere. So what I'm getting at is that it can also seem risky to rely exclusively on the Anglosphere to define for us what counts as African literature. I'm just wondering if you'd like to reflect on that. Would you agree, and is it possible to move beyond such constraints? If so, how? I think.
Well, let me just say one word about it. The position of Egypt is rather problematic as an African, as we're discussing African literature, because Egypt has a significant publishing industry, but it's oriented not towards Africa, but towards the Middle East. It's oriented towards Syria, Lebanon, Iraq. When we talk about African literature, we need to think about special cases like Egypt and perhaps the Arabic-speaking countries in North Africa. And then there is the dwindling question of South Africa. And I'm thinking here of Wilbur Smith. Wilbur Smith resided in South Africa for long periods of his life, had a secondary residence in South Africa, wrote about South Africa, probably had among his passports a South African passport, and sold more books about Africa than any other writer from South Africa, past or present. Is Wilbur Smith and the phenomenon that Wilbur Smith represents to be considered African as well? I raise the questions, I don't try to answer them.
I won't answer that. It's difficult to bring up Wilbur Smith because yes. Oh my. But it certainly pinpoints the fact that African belonging or identifying something as African is also an act of the will to some extent. It's a construction. There are many possibilities there. But finally, yes, I was sorry, Razak, I forgot. Would you like to comment on this question of the Anglosphere?
Anglosphere.
Yeah.
I think there has been not South Africa is a different situation altogether, because there has been a European presence, obviously here for many centuries, and so European languages already had a presence, both English and Afrikaans, of course. But thinking of, say, Zanzibar or Tanzania, I think there is a tremendous difference in the growth, I guess, of this, what you're calling Afrosphere. When I was 15, it was very, very unlikely that people of my parents' generation, that there would have been more than a tiny sprinkling of people who would have understood or spoken English. Certainly in my extended family, there were about 12 people. I don't think any of them could speak or understand English. My aunt loved the word crocodile. For some reason, she just liked the sound of it. And she loved hearing stories that I was bringing home from school. The story of Gulliver, that's Gulliver. But English doesn't mean a thing to them. Whereas the same family now, almost everybody speaks English, including the little ones. So I think there has been a change in this way, and I think the change is to do, to some extent, with education, of course, which has grown in a different way, not so elitist, but also television, cinema. To some extent, cinema has died in Zanzibar, so it can't be cinema. I think it must be television, the radio, I guess, perhaps a changing perception of what is useful to know, what is important, and so on. So I think it's a growing thing rather than and maybe this expresses the anxiety that you feel about this growth. I know there is a kind of a very determined resistance from the state, in Tanzania anyway, to the dominance or the ascendancy of English, but it's just simply unavoidable. And I think to some extent, which people don't always mention, or we haven't mentioned, is the United States. Kind of, to be a United States citizen or resident, English is given, a kind of primacy. And that also applies, I think, to its relations with other nations, other countries. So it isn't just empire, which left its mark, of course, but it's this continuing ascendancy of the United States, which makes English necessary.
Yes, and I think this growing phenomenon of the domination of the English language is in fact something we share in so many parts of the world, because it's acutely felt also in most parts of Europe, besides the UK and Ireland. So there's something there that could be investigated actually in a comparative spirit. But I mean, these questions around language also bring us to the question of translation. Something that the late Ngugi valued very highly. He even spoke of translation as the true language of humanity. And in practical terms, it is, of course, the way to negotiate the soft or hard boundaries between linguistic spheres. And, I mean, your novels have been widely translated. And a significant step forward in our day, I would say, I'm speaking here of a step forward in the academic conversation, has been that we have a much more fine-grained understanding of translation than before. And we also know that there is no such thing as simply a correct or an incorrect translation, which has also led to a greater appreciation of translators as a particular kind of writer in their own right. I'm wondering if you, in closing now, would care to share something of your interactions with your translators as they have rewritten your works in other languages. Would you like to begin, John?
Well, I respect translation deeply and have quite close relations with translators of the two languages that I have some command of, namely Dutch and German. I have worked closely with my translators in Dutch and German over many years, and in some respects, for example, my German translator is Reinhold Benke. I prefer her German versions to my English version. I think I come across more clearly in German than in English. And the same goes for my Dutch translator, Peter Bergsma. I think the voice in his Dutch translations is much more approachable and friendly than the voice in the English.
Well, fortunately, I don't read German, so I wouldn't know. But I do read Coetzee, and my translator in Coetzee is sitting right there on the front row of this theater. And well, we do have the occasional conversation, but otherwise she's completely competent, and I have every faith in what she does.
So basically you let the translators do their thing.
I mean, my feeling about translations and translators, which is probably that I perhaps could be more cautious in that, is that I trust my agents to know who they're speaking to. And then I also trust the publishers to whom they speak to find somebody who knows how to translate. Since I don't speak the language, or rather read the language, I have no way of checking. I have come across her once with somebody writing to say, not somebody who reads in that language, writing to say, this is terrible, this is disgusting, look at this, and sent a photocopied couple of pages with corrections. And I passed this back to my agents, who passed it back to the publisher, who said, very sorry, the editor was ill, so didn't check that properly, we'll put it right. So I don't know how many times that actually happens. But so I trust, and maybe this is incautious of me, but there you go.
Well, I'm happy to say that, in my opinion at least, you have a very good Swedish translator.
So I've been told, well, this is it. You rely, people say that. People say, readers that I do meet would say, who read in both languages, say English or German, might say it's a very good translation. So I think, okay, good. I'm pleased to hear that. But that's about as far as it goes. Otherwise, I just have to trust the publishers know what they're doing.
But it's clearly so that translators are very important agents in this larger literary economy that we've been talking about this evening. Thanks so much, John and Razak, for your very generous engagement in this conversation.
Thank you.
And with that, we can conclude.
Thank you so much, professors, and I welcome the invitation to play, Prof, playing the game of audaciously imagining a tomorrow that is true for us, that is true to us, by Afrika. And I heard a song in my head as you were speaking, Prof, and I'm not gonna sing, but that song reminds us once again, as ma-Afrika, go tsoga, re ikagele bophelo, re ikagele bokamoso. And so thank you so much, Profs, for the enduring reminder to assert our place as equals in the world. And with that, can I welcome Prof Stella Viljoen, who is the Vice Dean for Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at SU.
Dear friends and colleagues, I'll keep this short and try not to sound like an ostrich of potent digestion. It is my great honor to say a word of thanks, first to Professor Ramjuganath, our host this evening, but most importantly to our esteemed guests, Professors Coetzee Gurnah and Helgesson. I hope you'll forgive me for using the principle of rotation to thank you. Professor Coetzee, thank you for your irreverence, your ability to critique from within. To us, you are more than a writer. You are, and your influence has been that of what the Nobel Committee might call a scientist. Professor Gurnah, your paper, like your novels, has opened worlds. You are audacious in your subtlety. Professor Helgesson, we owe you a debt of gratitude for such a carefully curated and informed discussion. Thank you for thoughtful and provocative questions to our sometimes thorny laureates. I heard two students walking on campus. The one said to the other, "I don't mind that she day drinks, but when she drinks too much, she becomes colonial." Thank you to all three of you for a conversation that was powerful and persuasive, but also wonderfully decolonial.
And esteemed guests, I gather that maybe all that needed to be said has been said, or perhaps not. Perhaps there is a lingering thought that may do better with a glass of something chilled. And so please take up the invitation to connect once more over refreshments that are served just outside the room. Safe travels home, everyone. Thank you so much.